Taylor had rehearsed that exact sentence for the entire journey. On the bus ride from Logan Square to the wealthy, quiet enclaves of Lincoln Park, with her worn purse resting securely on her lap and the heavy envelope tucked safely inside, she had repeated the words softly, barely moving her lips exactly the way people do when they desperately need a specific moment to unfold perfectly on the very first try. It was a simple, direct statement, devoid of any unnecessary explanations or pleas for sympathy, completely lacking that subtle tone of someone asking for a massive favor, when, in reality, they are simply fulfilling a profound moral obligation. Her father had spent his entire life continuously insisting that a family name was the single most important thing a person possessed, the one intangible asset that nobody could ever take away unless you willingly surrendered it. Taylor had spent the last 8 months proving she fiercely believed his philosophy with every single cent she had aggressively saved, with every grueling overtime hour she had willingly accepted, and with every lonely weekend she had worked tirelessly while her peers were out, experiencing the vibrant energy of the city. She kept the relentless faith, because her father had been her entire world, and preserving his honor was the only way she knew how to properly mourn his devastating absence. She constantly calculated the remaining financial balance in a small, black-covered notebook she kept meticulously hidden in her kitchen drawer, because it was the kind of heavy burden that needed to be kept close and visible, reminding her every single day that the bone-deep exhaustion would eventually be worth the sacrifice. The city bus hissed to a halt just 2 blocks away from the designated address, and she stepped onto the cool pavement with a profound calmness that was not true tranquility, but rather an absolute, rigid emotional control. The subtle difference between the two states of mind is incredibly distinct, and Taylor knew it intimately because she had heavily relied on the latter for the better part of a very difficult year. The neighborhood street was incredibly wide and beautifully lined with ancient oak trees, possessing that specific, heavy silence characteristic of affluent areas where the parked vehicles are exceedingly expensive. The sidewalks are flawlessly maintained, and nobody ever feels the pressing need to rush their steps. Time simply functions differently in places where financial survival is never a daily, suffocating question, and Taylor absorbed this stark contrast to her own bustling neighborhood as she carefully checked the carved stone numbers on the elegant houses. She kept her hand firmly pressed against the outside of her purse, guarding the envelope, eventually stopping before a stunning property, when the address perfectly matched the destination written in her notebook. The beautiful mansion was not the type of architecture that aggressively demanded attention. It was the sophisticated type that confidently knew it required absolutely no introduction or flashy validation. It featured a clean facade composed of smooth concrete and expansive glass, a meticulously maintained front garden bursting with vibrant autumn foliage, and incredibly subtle lighting illuminating the stone steps leading up to the grand main entrance. Taylor stood entirely motionless at the wrought iron gate for a long second, not paralyzed by any sense of intimidation, but taking that necessary, quiet breath people require right before initiating an action that completely alters the trajectory of their day, and perhaps their life, before firmly pressing the doorbell. She waited briefly, expecting a stern security guard or a formal housekeeper, so she confidently pressed the button a second time with slightly more deliberate force, only to have the heavy wooden door swing open much faster than she had anticipated. The person standing there was not a guard, a maid, or the millionaire Ryan she had intensely researched. It was a little girl, roughly 4 years old, with wonderfully messy blonde hair secured by a slipping plastic clip. The child wore a cream-colored dress decorated with a distinct grape juice stain near the hem, and she stared up at Taylor with an expression of absolute, unblinking curiosity that only young children possess before society teaches them that staring is impolite. "Hello," the little girl announced with bright confidence. Taylor blinked once, momentarily derailed from her stoic preparation, and softly replied with a gentle greeting, her voice emerging much warmer than she had originally planned for this strictly professional afternoon encounter. "Are you the new doctor?" the young girl inquired, projecting that incredible, intense seriousness children utilize when treating every single question as an issue of supreme, undeniable importance. "No," Taylor answered with a very soft smile. "I am not the doctor." The girl paused, visibly processing this information as if mentally reviewing an internal checklist of acceptable visitors, before asking if she was the lady delivering the pie, which Taylor also gently denied. "Julia, who are you talking to?" A deep, resonant voice called out from deep inside the house, carrying the specific, undeniable weight of a vigilant father monitoring his child's exact whereabouts even from another room. Heavy, purposeful footsteps quickly approached, the kind of stride belonging to a man deeply accustomed to intercepting problems long before they managed to fully materialize in his sanctuary. Ryan suddenly appeared in the grand doorway, effortlessly lifting Julia into his strong arms with an automatic, practiced motion, giving Taylor exactly 1 second to visually register the tall, dark-haired man in the unbuttoned collar before her rehearsed words demanded to be spoken. Ryan possessed eyes that instantly evaluated Taylor in a mere fraction of a second, displaying the sharp precision of an incredibly successful businessman who is thoroughly accustomed to reading complex situations rapidly and who almost never makes an error in his judgment. She instantly recognized his sharp features from the corporate photographs she had carefully studied before arriving, an investigative habit directly inherited from her cautious father, who always believed in knowing exactly who sat across the metaphorical table. The professional pictures, however, completely failed to capture the deep, lingering exhaustion etched clearly around his dark eyes. Nor did they show the fiercely tender way he held his young daughter, protecting her rather than merely carrying her. "Good afternoon," Taylor stated, her voice emerging exactly as she had practiced in front of her mirror, firm, incredibly respectful, and completely devoid of any surface anxiety or intimidation. "My name is Taylor. My father was Anthony, the owner of the downtown printing press." A rapid, nearly imperceptible shift flashed across Ryan's tired face. A flicker she caught, only because her recent hardships had thoroughly trained her to observe subtle human reactions with intense, unwavering scrutiny. It was not a look of utter surprise, but rather an immediate, heavy recognition. He definitely remembered exactly who Anthony was, and the specific wording of her introduction had clearly triggered a profound realization within his mind. "I know exactly who your father is," Ryan replied slowly, his careful choice of present tense immediately catching Taylor's attention. "Was," she gently but firmly corrected him, refusing to let the harsh reality of her immense loss be softened by polite grammar. "He passed away 8 months ago." Ryan fell completely silent, and within that heavy, expanding quiet, Taylor found something she had never expected to witness on the face of a wealthy corporate creditor. It was neither coldness nor impatience, but a genuine anchoring weight, the distinct physical reaction of a man receiving deeply unfortunate news that fundamentally alters a previously established equation. "I am incredibly sorry for your tremendous loss," he offered, his deep voice carrying a raw sincerity that Taylor immediately recognized as genuine, having learned the harsh difference between authentic empathy and rehearsed corporate protocol over the agonizing past year. "Thank you," she respectfully acknowledged, before quickly opening her purse to retrieve the thick envelope, needing to complete her mission before any overwhelming emotions could potentially hijack her carefully maintained composure. She extended her hand with the quiet, undeniable strength of someone who had endured terrible things without breaking. "I came to pay his outstanding debt. The entire principal amount, alongside the agreed interest, is completely accounted for right here." Ryan stared intently at the thick paper envelope, then slowly shifted his intense gaze back up to her face, clearly processing the monumental effort this delivery must have required. Julia, still resting comfortably in her father's strong arms, had lazily rested her blonde head against his broad shoulder, succumbing to the heavy, late-afternoon drowsiness common to energetic young children. He deliberately refrained from taking the money immediately, watching Taylor with a deeply complex expression that was impossible to accurately categorize. It was not a rejection or a hesitation regarding the actual currency, but rather a profound curiosity, as if he were witnessing a rare phenomenon he had never anticipated encountering on his quiet front porch. How exactly did you manage to gather this substantial amount? Ryan quietly asked, the unexpected personal inquiry briefly catching Taylor completely off guard, as it deeply strayed from the transactional script she had meticulously memorized. By working continuously, she answered simply. In just 8 short months, he pressed, phrasing it not merely as a basic question, but as an absolute statement of sheer astonishment. There was something undeniably compelling in his quiet awe that Taylor could not fully name, a deep, respectful acknowledgement that touched her exhausted heart in a way she found strangely comforting, rather than intrusive. Ryan continued to study her face for another long second, displaying a quiet, concentrated thoughtfulness that Taylor swiftly identified as his natural of deeply processing unexpected information without revealing his internal turbulence. He glanced down at the envelope she still held suspended in the cool autumn air, then looked tenderly at Julia, who had finally closed her tired eyes completely, trusting her father's solid presence. He smoothly shifted his dark gaze back to Taylor and spoke an incredibly unexpected invitation, his tone blending a polite request with a gentle command. "Please, stay for dinner." Taylor remained frozen on the elegant porch, the envelope still awkwardly extended, possessing absolutely no prepared response for this baffling turn of events, because in none of her anxious mental scenarios on the city bus had she ever imagined breaking bread with her father's millionaire creditor. She slowly lowered her tired arm, thoroughly evaluating his sincere expression, attempting to locate any hidden motive or deceptive trap in his deep eyes. Finding absolutely nothing but genuine, exhausted kindness, she simply asked him why he would offer such a thing to a total stranger. Ryan softly explained that her father was a remarkably intelligent man he truly respected, and her fiercely honorable action today heavily deserved far more than a cold, brief dismissal at the front door. Crossing the threshold of the magnificent mansion, Taylor felt an incredibly strange sensation, as if the rigid, defensive walls she had built around her heavy heart over the past several months were slowly beginning to dissolve. The spacious kitchen was unexpectedly warm and incredibly inviting, lacking the sterile, unapproachable coldness usually associated with such massive, wealthy homes. Dark marble countertops beautifully contrasted with warm wooden cabinets, and a massive 6-burner stove dominated the cooking area, clearly indicating that this space was utilized frequently and with great passion. What truly captured her complete attention, however, was a delightfully chaotic crayon drawing proudly secured to the massive stainless steel refrigerator by a solitary magnet, an intimate, messy detail that humanized the entire grand estate. Ryan gently placed the deeply sleeping Julia onto a plush sofa in the adjacent living room, carefully covering her small form with a lightweight, woven throw blanket, before quietly returning to the kitchen. He began retrieving fresh vegetables and various ingredients from the large refrigerator with the smooth, practiced efficiency of a man who cooked elaborate meals on a daily basis. "Do you truly cook every single day?" Taylor asked from the kitchen threshold, still feeling slightly out of place with her heavy purse clutched tightly in her hands. He nodded without immediately turning around, explaining that Julia was incredibly particular and often refused to eat properly when a stranger prepared her food, a small detail that revealed his deep dedication. "You can certainly help if you want. There are several onions that desperately need to be chopped," Ryan offered casually pointing toward a heavy wooden cutting board and a gleaming chef's knife resting on the island. Taylor briefly wondered if this was some bizarre psychological test, but quickly realized it was simply his authentic, entirely unpretentious nature shining through the awkwardness of the situation. She thoroughly washed her hands at the deep sink, effectively shedding the lingering grime of the city bus, and stepped up to the large island. There was something wonderfully absurd, yet profoundly comforting about standing in a wealthy stranger's kitchen, chopping onions while her father's massive debt sat quietly inside her nearby purse. They worked together in a highly functional, strangely intimate silence, the kind of rare, comfortable quiet that organically exists between two individuals who feel absolutely no desperate need to fill the empty air with meaningless, superficial chatter. Taylor chopped the pungent onions with the rapid, ruthless efficiency of an exhausted woman who usually cooked strictly for basic survival, while Ryan tended the hot pans with the slow, deliberate care of a man who genuinely treated culinary creation as a beloved sanctuary. The two entirely different rhythms blended seamlessly within the warm kitchen, creating a wonderful symphony of sizzling oil and rhythmic chopping that felt remarkably like a forgotten piece of home. Without turning his dark head from the simmering stove, Ryan finally broke the silence, his deep voice heavily saturated with careful thought. "Your father approached me 2 years ago, desperately needing a substantial financial injection to keep his printing business fully operational during a severe economic downturn." Taylor continued to chop, her hands perfectly steady. The changing market was incredibly cruel to his outdated equipment, and the traditional banks outright refused his multiple credit applications. Ryan continued, describing Anthony as the rare kind of formidable man who commanded immediate respect the moment he entered any corporate boardroom. Taylor paused her knife for merely a fraction of a second, proudly acknowledging that her father had indeed possessed an unforgettable, powerful presence. "Exactly how much did you know about his dire financial situation before he passed?" Ryan inquired, his tone completely lacking any offensive judgment, offering only a profound, respectful curiosity. Taylor carefully scooped the chopped onions, her voice completely steady, as she explained that while her father vehemently hated causing her any worry, she had long ago learned how to silently read the terrifying hidden numbers. She detailed how his sudden, devastating illness rapidly accelerated the inevitable corporate collapse, forcing her to immediately liquidate the heavy printing machinery to cover the urgent medical bills, leaving only Ryan's massive loan and a few smaller debts which she had already meticulously cleared on her own. Ryan immediately turned away from the hot stove, his usually controlled expression entirely replaced by an incredibly raw, unguarded look of sheer astonishment. "You successfully paid off all of those other aggressive creditors completely by yourself?" he asked, heavily emphasizing the sheer magnitude of her solitary, monumental achievement. Taylor simply stated that her father's honorable name was now her own personal responsibility to protect, offering the profound truth without a single ounce of boastful pride. Ryan stared at her for a long, silent moment, visually processing the incredible depth of her unyielding loyalty, before silently returning to his cooking, his quiet reverence speaking much louder than any extravagant words of praise ever could. Julia eventually wandered back into the warm kitchen, her small hands firmly clutching her trailing blanket, her bright eyes slowly taking inventory of the changed environment. She observed Taylor sitting near the large island and immediately questioned her continued presence with that brutal, wonderful honesty exclusive to young children. Upon learning that her father had invited the stranger to stay, Julia casually climbed onto a tall stool, intensely watching Taylor's face. "I always cry whenever I chop onions," the little girl gravely announced, treating it as a serious personal flaw. Taylor offered a gentle, empathetic smile, softly assuring the child that everyone occasionally cries, establishing a quiet, immediate bond that Ryan covertly observed with a hidden, grateful smile. The magnificent dinner concluded with Julia ultimately falling asleep once again, her head resting peacefully against the wooden dining table, entirely defeated by the long, eventful day. Ryan effortlessly scooped his sleeping daughter into his strong arms, smoothly carrying her up the grand staircase to her bedroom, while Taylor instinctively began clearing the empty plates. She was standing at the deep sink, warm water running over her soapy hands, when Ryan quietly returned, immediately grabbing a clean cotton towel to help dry the dishes, without a single word of protest. Working side by side in the dimming evening light, Taylor felt an incredibly foreign sense of domestic peace wrapping around her exhausted shoulders, completely defying the anxious expectation she had harbored all morning. Taylor deliberately broke the comfortable silence, pointing out that he had never officially stated whether he would accept the thick envelope of cash she had brought. Ryan paused his drying, deliberately folding the white towel and placing it neatly on the marble counter before turning to face her completely. He softly demanded she call him by his first name, insisting that hearing formal titles made him feel entirely too rigid and corporate. He then looked deeply into her eyes. firmly stating that they would extensively discuss the complicated financial matter tomorrow, declaring that her tremendous journey, her shared dinner, and her kind assistance with the dishes were more than enough for one single night. The following morning, Taylor sat alone in her tiny Logan Square apartment, the cold coffee sitting completely neglected in her favorite ceramic mug, while her dark eyes stared intensely at her black notebook. The final, massive number was firmly crossed out with a thick horizontal line, visually symbolizing the definitive end of her agonizing, 8-month crusade, yet the heavy envelope still remained securely hidden inside her purse. She was aggressively wrestling with the confusing reality that returning to Lincoln Park meant the previous evening was not just an isolated, bizarre anomaly, but potentially the terrifying beginning of something entirely new and undefined. Her chaotic internal debate was suddenly interrupted by a brief vibration from her mobile phone resting on the worn table. The unexpected text message was from Ryan, asking a remarkably simple question about her typical breakfast habits. Taylor stared suspiciously at the brightly glowing screen, highly unsure of how to navigate this unprecedented situation, until a second message rapidly arrived. Ryan honestly confessed that young Julia had woken up actively asking if Taylor was returning, and he had absolutely no idea how to properly answer his daughter. The sheer, unvarnished honesty of a wealthy, powerful man hiding behind his tiny daughter's innocent curiosity melted Taylor's remaining defensive resolve. She quickly typed a brief confirmation, promising to arrive at his large estate promptly at 10 o'clock, ignoring the frantic fluttering in her chest. Before catching the city bus, Taylor made a brief stop at her local neighborhood grocer, purchasing some fresh fruit while exchanging warm, genuine smiles with Sarah, the hard-working cashier she saw nearly every day. Sarah immediately noticed a distinct difference, loudly commenting that Taylor looked significantly lighter, as if a massive invisible boulder had finally been lifted from her tired shoulders. Taylor merely offered a mysterious smile in response, unable to fully articulate the profound emotional shift occurring within her. The rumbling bus ride back to the affluent northern neighborhood felt infinitely shorter this time, her mind entirely occupied by the strange, magnetic pull drawing her back to a house she barely knew. Julia was eagerly waiting by the large front window, immediately running to swing the heavy door open before Taylor could even reach the brass doorbell. The little girl aggressively complained about a minor, 2-minute delay with the strict authority of a demanding supervisor, dramatically turning her back and marching toward the kitchen with her blanket dragging across the hardwood floor. Ryan was standing comfortably by the large oven, dressed entirely casually in a soft cotton shirt and faded jeans, pulling a hot tray of freshly baked golden buttermilk biscuits from the intense heat. He immediately pushed a steaming mug of dark coffee toward Taylor the exact moment she sat down, entirely remembering her preferences from the brief observation the previous evening. After a few moments of comfortable silence, Ryan finally addressed the lingering financial elephant in the room, his voice taking on a slightly more serious, measured tone. He calmly revealed a secret that Anthony had fiercely kept from his daughter. Recognizing the severe severity of the older man's illness, Ryan had completely paused the aggressive interest accumulation on the massive loan 6 months prior. Taylor froze, her coffee mug hovering midway to her mouth, as Ryan gently explained that her incredibly meticulous calculations were fundamentally incorrect. Because of his silent grace, she had massively overpaid the debt, and he firmly insisted on legally transferring a significant portion of the hard-earned money back into her personal bank account. Taylor stubbornly argued, her fierce pride temporarily flaring, but Ryan smoothly countered her protests by deliberately pushing a warm, buttered biscuit across the table, playfully using the incredible food as an undeniable bargaining chip. The delicious, flaky pastry was incredibly comforting, and Taylor found herself involuntarily closing her eyes to fully savor the rich flavor, completely disarming her defensive posture. When she opened her eyes, Ryan was watching her with a genuinely spectacular, unrestrained smile, and Julia was happily reading a colorful book, occasionally asking brilliant rapid-fire questions about Taylor's Native American grandmother. The rest of the bright morning effortlessly melted away in that beautiful kitchen, completely dissolving the heavy, transactional boundaries that had originally brought them together. The substantial electronic financial refund arrived exactly on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, accompanied by a remarkably simple notification that merely read "settlement" in the digital description. Taylor carefully updated her worn black notebook one final time, logging the positive deposit before permanently sliding the incredibly significant book into the dark recesses of her kitchen drawer. She then traveled downtown to the busy architecture firm, where she functioned as an incredibly efficient administrative assistant, essentially acting as the crucial invisible glue holding the chaotic, creative office together. Her demanding job required absolute precision and endless patience, qualities she had thoroughly mastered long before her father's tragic passing forced her to manage infinitely larger, more terrifying crises. Marcus, a highly experienced senior architect known for his sharp eyes and demanding nature, paused near her desk that afternoon. Immediately noticing the profound shift in her general aura, he softly commented that she finally looked like a young woman who was actually allowed to breathe, rather than a desperate soldier bracing for an inevitable, catastrophic impact. Taylor offered him a deeply genuine, unforced smile, acknowledging that a very old, very heavy chapter of her life had finally reached a proper conclusion. She spent the remainder of her busy shift organizing complex blueprints and managing difficult client schedules, feeling an incredible, unfamiliar lightness anchoring her steady movements. Later that evening, her mobile phone buzzed with another message from Ryan, this one heavily laced with a charmingly desperate tone of parental panic. He confessed that tomorrow was Julia's highly anticipated birthday, and he had foolishly promised to create homemade chocolate truffles, a delicate culinary task, he admitted. He was entirely unequipped to successfully execute without causing a massive kitchen disaster. Taylor read the frantic message twice, feeling a massive wave of absolute tenderness completely wash over her previously guarded heart. She immediately fired back a swift reply, demanding to know exactly what time she needed to arrive, entirely ignoring Ryan's polite attempts to retract his desperate plea for culinary assistance. Taylor arrived the next morning armed with premium cocoa powder, real butter, and excessive amounts of brightly colored sprinkles, fully understanding that sprinkles were absolutely non-negotiable for any child's celebration. The massive kitchen instantly became Julia's personal kingdom. The birthday girl wore a slightly crooked paper crown and actively supervised the messy process with incredible, hilarious authority. Taylor patiently guided the young girl's small hands, carefully demonstrating the precise, delicate rolling motion required to create the perfect, round chocolate truffles. Ryan stood leaning quietly against the marble counter, his arms loosely crossed, simply watching the two of them interact with an expression of profound, quiet gratitude that entirely filled the large room. While enthusiastically rolling a truffle in bright pink sprinkles, Julia completely unexpectedly mentioned a beautiful, silly song her mother used to sing whenever they baked together. The sudden, innocent mention of the tragically deceased woman caused a heavy, incredibly thick silence to instantly descend upon the previously joyful kitchen. Taylor instinctively glanced toward Ryan, witnessing a flash of devastating, raw vulnerability completely shatter his usually composed features, revealing the immense, hidden depths of his lingering grief. Instead of awkwardly changing the subject, Taylor gently encouraged Julia to sing the special song, honoring the lost mother's memory and allowing the heavy moment to breathe with beautiful, heartbreaking grace. Later, while an exhausted Julia took her mandatory birthday nap, Ryan and Taylor stood entirely alone in the quiet kitchen, the perfectly formed chocolate truffles proudly lined up on a silver platter. Ryan sincerely thanked her for saving the birthday, admitting that while he could have easily purchased expensive desserts, having genuine, homemade warmth meant everything to his young daughter. He then shifted his intense gaze directly to Taylor, asking with deep, genuine curiosity about her life, outside of heroically paying off massive debts and rescuing desperate fathers from baking disasters. She proudly explained her vital role at the busy architecture firm, firmly shutting down any notion that her administrative title somehow limited her vast intelligence or deep spatial understanding. Over the incredibly fast weeks that subsequently followed, Their unexpected connection organically deepened through a series of easy, unplanned encounters that felt remarkably, completely natural. During a sunny weekend walk through a sprawling city park, Julia excitedly wrapped her small arms completely around a massive ancient oak tree, absolutely fascinated by its incredible size. While Taylor gently explained the fascinating history of the deep roots and wide branches, Ryan secretly snapped a beautiful, candid photograph of her softly smiling face. When Taylor raised a questioning eyebrow at the sudden click of the camera, he simply offered a devastatingly honest smile, claiming Julia would definitely want to remember this perfect afternoon. Sitting quietly on a wooden park bench while Julia eventually fell asleep, leaning heavily against his side, Ryan finally opened up completely about his beautiful late wife, Chloe. He recounted the sudden, terrifying brain aneurysm that had stolen her away 3 incredibly long years ago, leaving him entirely alone to raise a tiny daughter who possessed absolutely no direct memories of her mother. Taylor listened with complete, unwavering attention, deliberately offering absolutely none of the hollow, empty platitudes or pitying expressions she knew grieving people deeply despised. Ryan quietly confessed that balancing the overwhelming weight of Chloe's permanent absence with the joyous, demanding presence of Julia was an exhausting, daily battle, and Taylor simply nodded, profoundly understanding the brutal, beautiful duality of enduring love and deep grief. The comfortable routine was delightfully interrupted the following week when Julia audaciously commandeered her father's mobile phone, directly calling Taylor with an incredibly urgent, highly specific culinary demand. The brave little girl loudly complained that Ryan's recent, tragic attempt at baking savory chicken turnovers had resulted in completely misshapen, severely unappetizing disasters that offended her aesthetic sensibilities. Taylor was forced to quickly step out of the quiet architecture office into a busy hallway, utterly unable to control her genuine, ringing laughter at the child's incredibly serious, dramatic tone. When Ryan finally retrieved his stolen device, his voice was filled with deep, charming embarrassment. But Taylor had already firmly promised to dedicate her entire Saturday to fixing the turnover tragedy. That Saturday effortlessly transformed into a beautifully chaotic, flower-covered marathon inside the grand Lincoln Park mansion, stretching beautifully from the bright morning well into the late, glowing afternoon. Taylor expertly guided Julia through the remarkably complex process of kneading the soft dough and perfectly seasoning the shredded chicken, utilizing her grandmother's secret, heavily guarded spice combination. Even though the final turnovers emerged from the hot oven looking slightly lopsided and delightfully imperfect, Julia aggressively declared them the absolute greatest food ever created in human history. I simply watched the flour-dusted pair from the kitchen island, his dark eyes radiating an incredible, quiet warmth that constantly tracked Taylor's effortless, joyful movements around his usually quiet home. After a massive, satisfying dinner consisting almost entirely of the freshly baked chicken turnovers, Julia predictably surrendered to deep exhaustion, falling asleep on the plush living room sofa. Taylor and Ryan naturally assumed their now familiar, comfortable positions at the large kitchen sink, falling into the quiet, incredibly intimate rhythm of washing and drying the evening dishes. Suddenly, Ryan completely stopped moving, carefully laying the damp cotton towel onto the dark marble counter before turning to face Taylor with an expression stripped entirely of any protective barriers. He asked her, his voice incredibly low and remarkably steady, exactly what this rapidly developing relationship truly meant to her, demanding absolute, unvarnished honesty. Slowly turned off the rushing water, gently drying her hands while intensely holding his dark, searching gaze, refusing to retreat from the profound weight of his direct question. She stated, with absolute unwavering clarity, that this connection was something she had never mathematically planned for, yet she had completely stopped attempting to rationally ignore it, because ignoring something so undeniably real was a massive waste of precious energy. Ryan took a slow, deliberate step closer, effectively closing the physical distance between them, his eyes locked fiercely onto hers. He softly admitted that he, too, had completely abandoned any foolish attempts to ignore the powerful, magnetic pull between them, his profound honesty stripping away all remaining pretenses. The very next Tuesday evening, Julia eagerly ambushed Taylor at the heavy front door, proudly clutching a brand-new, incredibly colorful crayon drawing she had painstakingly created. The vivid artwork clearly depicted three distinct stick figures tightly holding hands. A tall man with dark hair, a tiny blonde girl, and a woman with long hair standing firmly the protective center. When Taylor softly asked who the third figure represented, Julia looked at her as if the answer was the most obvious, undeniable fact in the entire universe, simply stating Taylor's name. Taylor felt a massive, overwhelming wave of deep emotion completely crash into her chest, her eyes instantly filling with happy, unshed tears as she requested permission to keep the beautiful masterpiece. Julia granted permission but firmly dictated a strict, non-negotiable condition. The incredibly important drawing absolutely had to be proudly displayed on the kitchen refrigerator. The young girl wisely declared, with the absolute, unshakable conviction only a child possesses, that the large refrigerator was the specific, designated sanctuary where all truly important things belonged. Ryan silently walked over, retrieving a bright sun-shaped magnet from a lower drawer, his eyes shining with profound, unguarded affection as he handed it directly to Taylor. Together, standing shoulder to shoulder in the warm, brightly lit kitchen, they carefully secured the beautiful family portrait to the stainless steel door, solidifying a bond that had begun with a heavy envelope and transformed into unexpected grace. Julia watched the two adults with a deeply satisfied, sleepy smile, clearly incredibly proud of her artistic contribution and her successful emotional matchmaking. Ryan effortlessly lifted his tired daughter into his strong arms, letting her rest against his broad chest, before smoothly wrapping his free arm completely around Taylor's waist, pulling her close. They stood quietly together in the heart of the beautiful home, safely anchored by the bright sun magnet and the simple, undeniable truth of their shared presence. Taylor looked at the messy drawing, marveling at how a journey that began with profound grief and rigid obligation had miraculously led her to this exact, perfect moment of absolute belonging. Taylor looked at the sun-shaped magnet holding their vibrant lives together and realized something profoundly important about the unpredictable human journey. We frequently spend so much of our weary youth drawing incredibly straight lines, falsely believing that solemn duty and heavy sacrifice must always be entirely lonely roads, permanently devoid of any unexpected, beautiful scenery. Yet, true, enduring resilience is never merely about stubbornly weathering the bitter, freezing storms alone. Rather, it is about keeping your bruised heart open enough to bravely recognize the sudden, genuine warmth of a newly offered hand. Life rarely repays our fierce integrity in the exact, calculated currency we initially expect to receive. Instead, it patiently waits until we have completely surrendered our rigid need for absolute control, until we are genuinely brave enough to stand in our authentic, vulnerable truth, and then it generously presents us with incredible blessings that entirely defy logical explanation. Healing does not mean aggressively erasing the deep scars of those we have tragically lost. Rather, it is the quiet, daily courage to let new, vibrant love grow amidst the lingering, heavy echoes of the past. When you courageously do the right thing simply because it is fundamentally right, the vast universe ultimately answers not with a cold ledger of perfectly balanced debts, but with a warm kitchen filled with ringing laughter, a child's messy crayon masterpiece, and the profound, enduring grace of a spectacular love that feels exactly like finally coming home.